This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L.W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
There's a great quote from a long time ago from a guy named Scoop Nisker. He used to be a radio personality around here. And he had, if you don't like, he ended his news broadcast every time. If you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. And that sort of, I guess, the sort of at least the way I think about this course is, so the question is, how does one go about doing that? If you wanted to go out and make different news, what would you do? And I want to kind of, you know, that part of the course is getting you to think about what's the difference between, I think, where a lot of people start with environmental stuff, which is, we got to fix this problem. Something's wrong. It's awful. You know, and sort of Young talks about this in the chapter. I don't know if any of you read the chapter for today, but Young talks about kind of one response to what you see out there in the world is just depression, right? Just pessimism, that in fact, we're screwing up the world. There's not much you can do about it. So, you know, either you get depressed or go out and have a good time or whatever, but not do anything about it. The other, I think, response you see a lot of is, we've got to do X to fix this problem. And in some ways, the other reading for today, this thing that was on the web, International Environmental Policy Making and Transatlantic Cooperation, setting the agenda for Rio +10, is in some ways that, you know, next year will be the 10th year of Rio. I think if you look at, if you kind of look at the environment today, you know, or next year, 10 years later, and you say how much progress have we made, it's probably pretty hard to say that we've made a lot of progress. You know, it would be difficult to make the claim that we made a lot of progress. At a minimum, we may have slowed the tide a bit, and even that would be questionable. But as you look through this document, you see a lot of things like, it goes through, it's basically a series of recommendations. And I guess the question I would have, okay, so this is all about things we can do to help improve the environment, okay, you know, to help make the international environment better. And let me just read some of them to you, and then what jumps out at you. Respect developing country interests. Rebalance the current economic bias of transatlantic cooperation, meaning make environmental things be in economic decision-making. Economic factors enter environmental factors enter economic decision-making. Establish multi-stakeholder fora to advance transatlantic environmental cooperation. Push for mutual recognition of progressive environmental standards. Establish eco-labeling schemes. Support the development of integrated public product policy standards. Ensure that the future international investment rules include sustainability issues. Reform environmentally perverse subsidies and expand green procurement. Promote the development of green investment programs. Establish a synergetic relationship between the Intergovernmental Forum on Forests and the Convention on Biological Diversity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What, I guess rather than, you know, what do you think of all these, what do you think my response to all of these is? And it's sort of a response that I would like you to have. What should be the question that, when we've just had a list of 20 policy things, how should you respond to these? Sarah and then Eli.
Well, sort of just what you made is they're a little vague.
Okay, they're vague? Yep.
I guess my question would be why, and like what they hope to accomplish, or like what leads them to these decisions. Because like putting out all these things like, yeah, eco-labeling, that's great, but what is that going to accomplish? Like why should we implement that over something else?
Okay, great, yeah. I mean, that's my response is, okay, would it work, right? Again, bring food aid to the Sudan. Sounds like a great idea, okay? And it may be. In a vast bulk of cases, things like what happened in the Sudan don't happen, right? I mean, the vast bulk of times when we try to do something, we kind of get in that direction. We don't move in the wrong direction. But sometimes we do. And more importantly, lots of times we don't make any progress at all. A lot of heat and light, I mean, you know, a lot of heat and smoke, but not much light, not much movement, not much progress. So I guess the question is, where do these come from? What's the evidence that supports that this is the way to go? That these will help first, and then what Eli's raising is, and will they help more than the alternatives? More than beat up on the polluters? Why establish an eco-label system? Why don't we just slap upside the head anybody who pollutes, right? Why don't we impose a huge tax? Why don't we give subsidies? Why don't we have government funding of technology development? How do you choose among those? All those sound great. I could have gone through those too. You know, I could list things we should do to protect the environment from now till next Tuesday. And the question is we have limited resources. In fact, unfortunately, the amount of resources for environmental stuff is really limited, right? That's part of the problem, is that we don't spend enough to protect the environment. And so the question is given that that's not likely to change, yes, we maybe will make progress. More of you will give every year to environmental groups than you did, you know, than your parents do, whatever. But those resources are going to be quite limited. How do we use them more effectively, strategically, efficiently? You know, deploy those resources in a way that they'll make more difference. And that's the questions I want you to raise, and then to say, and how would we know? And what would we do for research to try to figure out what's the best way to go? How do we make, you know, and I think largely it's been a case of how do you know that one thing worked? And then I did try to raise in the kind of relative effectiveness, which one works better? That's even a harder, you know, that's the next level of difficulty in terms of trying to get there. But I think that's, if you leave the class with nothing else, is a sense of, one, of at least asking those questions. How would you know if that was a good policy? And then second, with something like the beginnings of a mode of answering those questions, of saying, what's the counterfactual? You know, I'd feel successful if you guys went into a jury box, and when they say, this person is getting sick because of that, you say, what's the rate of that sickness in all the people who weren't exposed to that? If you could go into a jury box and do that, that's progress for me, because too many people in jury boxes don't do that, don't understand that you need to compare to the counterfactual. What would have happened if that chemical plant hadn't been upstream? You know, and that works both ways. I mean, I'm pushing it on the kind of the one where your biases are likely to go with the person who's being harmed by what seems to be an environmental problem, but it should work the other way around. So, you know, that it should work, that when somebody says, oh, well, that's not causing any harm, then explain to me why there's a 20% leukemia rate in this community, right? You know, and the base rate is only 5% in the society at large. Then you explain to me, Mr. Chemical Manufacturer, why you have a much higher leukemia rate in this community rather than in the population. That's much higher than in the population at large. So I'm not trying to just push an anti-environmental view, of course, but I'm trying to challenge you to say, we've got limited resources deployment against problems, against the solutions to problems. And I think, one of the things I liked about what Risa and some other people were doing, Risa raised it most explicitly, is to say, hey, they were solving the wrong problem. You know, fix over-harvesting when the problem is habitat destruction. Well, you can stop people from fishing all day long, but if you don't blow up the dams and take them out, the fish can't get home and to spawn. So you're solving the wrong problem. So solving the tragedy of the commons is not the issue you need to solve in some of these fisheries cases. What you need to solve is, how do we balance this need for electricity and hydropower against the need for fish stocks to survive? So I think that's the main thing. And just the last caveat is that this is not like sort of urging you, oh, always do more research. You know, it's not a call for further research, you know, that we just should keep staying in our little ivory towers, not do anything. No, go out and make some of your own news. But do it well. Do it so the news that comes out is not the news about something like the Sudan, right? So the news isn't, here's another environmental group screwing it up by proposing the wrong policy and following through it. where have we come in the course? What have we learned? Sort of going through the variety of perspectives, for environmental problems: technological, economic, political, legal, eco-philosophical, kind of just. And I think, I don't know if that just at least helps frame the way when you see people making policy proposals, where they're coming from, what their view of the world is, what they think the problems are, what they think the solutions are, why they think they'll work. And then and in most cases there's some mix, right? I mean, anything about sort of property rights is a combination of legal and economic views of the world, right? The notion that if we give property rights, that it allows the sort of getting prices right because the person who has legal right to a property won't abuse it, right? So that it and will only sell those rights to the extent they get the proper payment for them. So there's some combination there. But thinking about the different perspectives, that people come at these problems from, going through how do we identify problems, about is it just science? And I think there's a kind of increasing tendency to see science as as going to help us identify all the problems, when a lot of the problems can be identified through the kind of identity politics that Tesh and Williams talk about, this sense that, hey, no, people out there, people collect data too. I'm collecting data on my life every day. And if me and a bunch of other homeowners in my area say this seems to be happening, that's the beginning of a scientific process. And so to look at this notion of that it's not, we can't just rely on all these high-powered scientists at Stanford and Harvard and wherever, Caltech, who are going to say, here's the problem, and wait for them to tell us when there's a problem. And more importantly, maybe we can't wait until, last night on on McNeil Lehrer, you have this going around the block about the Bush recanting on CO2 emissions, right? And you have somebody saying, on national TV saying, no, there's no consensus about climate change and it's really uncertain. Yes, it's really uncertain. Most of life is really uncertain. We are completely uncertain about when we will die, every single one of us. And yet we make a lot of choices based on expectations about that, right? And so I think, there is uncertainty, and the question is, what do you do in the face of that uncertainty? And essentially underlying this person's view was, in the face of uncertainty, continue going on about your business. We don't know where the cliff is, so let's just keep driving full speed ahead, right? There may be a cliff out there may not, so let's not worry about it. And I think you want to at least say, in most cases, you're going to have uncertainty. How do you deal with uncertainty? We didn't talk much about the precautionary principle, but it's an important part that's a different model about how you deal with uncertainty. About, in the face of uncertainty, don't take actions that might cause harm, rather than don't worry about it, right? And so think about how you deal with uncertainty, and recognize that scientists can't ever give you certainty. And the other part of this is this almost this combination of identity politics and disinterested politics. This notion that problems are not just some set of facts out there in the world. Problems are a combination of facts and values. Problems are a fact about the world that we don't like, and other people may like, right? The loss of the killing of whales is only a problem if you think killing whales is wrong, right? A loss of a species is only a problem if it's a species we care about. Nobody seems to be too concerned about all the mosquitoes we kill every year, right? In mosquito eradication programs or malaria protection programs, right? Nobody seems to be too worried about whether we're going to kill off all those mosquitoes. So it's not a problem. It's not an environmental problem. So and think about this combination that there's always values embedded in deciding that something's a problem or not. It's always about what you want to prioritize versus what you don't. We talked a lot about how we negotiate solutions, and I think you got a sense of that too last week with this, in the climate change case of, well, you know where you want to be, and it's really hard to get there because other people don't share your values. And how do you form coalitions? How do you get there, etc.? We spent a hell of a lot of time, perhaps too much from a lot of your perspectives, on kind of compliance and effectiveness. How do we make sure things work? I guess partly because it seems to me that's the thing is least understood. That is least understood in international environmental politics is how we get better at what we're doing. And I think the important distinction here is between solving problems and managing problems. Very few environmental problems will we solve. Most of these are management problems. We're going to have to keep regulating our harvest and habitat destruction of fish for a long time. We're not going to find something to do and then do it and then it's over and then fish will survive happily for the rest of all time. No, we're going to have to, in CO2, we're not going to solve this problem. We're going to manage it. We're going to constantly be in a battle between how much global warming are we willing to tolerate versus how much economic costs are we willing to incur. And we're going to have to balance that, not just through 2012, not through 2050, not through 2100, but for the rest of human existence, and at least until we find some kinds of ways of feeding the energy hunger of the Earth without using things that create CO2. I mean, that may be the solution. Maybe we can find a way to solve it with photovoltaics, right, and solar power. But hey, where do we get the power to make the solar power? To make the solar panels, right? Where does that come in? What are all the all the environmental costs that we don't even know yet about old photovoltaic cells that we have to dispose of somehow? Where do they get disposed of? What are the, how do those leach into our water table, right? I mean, those are all the problems we haven't even thought about yet, but they will be out there, trust me. Those kinds of problems are going to be out there. And I think something we haven't engaged yet, but we haven't engaged it because I don't, I assume that it's one of the problems that A, that you already are engaged in, and B, that I can't teach you much about, which is how do you make normative judgments? How do you make moral judgments about what you value, about what's important? How do you make a choice between, no, this Inuit culture should die, or some aspect of this Inuit culture should die because I don't want the bowhead whales to be more threatened. I don't want to let them kill bowhead whales anymore. How do you make I can't tell you anything about that. That's something you have to choose based on your sets of values and hopefully based on discussions of people who have different values than you and not trying to understand why they have those values, why they hold those values, and then kind of developing some sense about what are your priorities, what are your policy priorities, how do you make trade-offs, and how do you take responsibility for the fact that sometimes you are willing to say, I'm sorry, I value the whale's existence more than the continuing existence of that part of your culture, or vice versa, right? And to take responsibility for the fact that you're willing to say, yeah, it's important enough to me that certain humans, that Inuits up in Alaska, continue that part of their culture that's linked to killing whales for as long as they can, up until the time at which they kill all the whales. And I'm willing to take that risk. That's important to me because I think that culture is worth preserving, because I think if I have to choose between preserving that culture and preserving the species, I want to choose preserving the culture. And I might look for innovative ways of trying to do both. I mean, that's what it should force you to do, to say, but don't ignore that one's going to happen, right? But rather to engage the fact that there's a conflict and you have to figure out how to make both happen. And it's at the extreme, you're going to have to make a choice in most cases. There's not a way to have all the good things go together. You're going to have to make some choices. Some people are going to get hurt, some people are going to get helped in that process. There's Murray Gell-Mann, who was, like, in 1969 won the Nobel Prize in Physics for quarks, discovering quarks, subatomic particles. And he's switched over. He's now at the Santa Fe Institute, which some of you may know about as a big institute in Santa Fe that does sort of very alternative, kind of something between eco-philosophical and scientific approaches to a lot of interesting problems. And Gell-Mann is now quite old and has been a major player in physics for a long time, but he's now switched several years back and had a nice article that I used to assign. I didn't assign it this year, but kind of what are the 7 interlinked transitions needed for the Earth to survive? It's him thinking big thoughts about what are the things what are the changes that have to happen for the Earth to survive, and he lays out 7. First is a demographic transition. I'll get them up and then we'll talk about them. Technological transition. Economic. Social. Institutional. Informational. And ideological. And in some ways, these are not all that different than sort of the original 5 I started out with. But the demographic transition is that we really need to slow the rate of population growth. I mean, that's the short form. We have to change, how many kids we're having. And it was interesting. There was an NPR piece the other morning, or no, it was like Talk of the Nation or something. But they were talking to the current the people who had just finished the UN's World Population Report, and they had this discussion. And what was remarkable, I mean, and this goes down to an ideological transition that has to occur. What was remarkable in this discussion were the underlying assumption was that continuing growth of populations was a good thing. And that we needed to worry about, that while everybody was saying there's too many people in the world, right? All the sides were saying there's too many people in the world and we need to worry about too many people in the world. The vast bulk of the discussion was, well, here's a problem because this country's rate is below replacement. Right? Well, you can't have everybody in the world, every country in the world have an increase in population and have the overall population in the world go down. Those two don't go together. But a really underlying assumption that countries that are not replacing their population should worry about it, right? So that's sort of the easiest one. So it's just need to lower the number of people. The technological is need to lower the impact per person, right? The environmental impact per person. So get new technologies that so that we get photovoltaics, so we get sorts of energy sources that allow us to do what we do in a way that has less impacts on the environment, and people are doing that. And a lot of you will, I imagine, end up working for corporations at some point in your life. And hopefully part of what you'll be doing is saying, how do we reduce the waste stream and the kind of environmental externalities that this company produces, The economic transition, charge the real cost of things. Well, I mean, it really does. It continues to floor me that there's no serious discussion in this country about an energy tax, and that nobody is talking about 30 cents a kilowatt hour. Gray Davis, I guess, just yesterday said, well, we'll give people some kind of incentive if they can reduce their summer energy use by 20%. So that's movement in the right direction, to say let's give people positive incentives for doing the right thing, right, for doing something we want to do. But getting a sense of saying, but none of this is all of this is just talking about mainly because we don't have enough current capacity. Nobody's talking about the fact that this is, nobody's making the connection between this and climate change, but between this and, urban smog, between this and all the, this and lakes being dammed up, all the other environmental impacts of our energy production system. And, and you should, and it should challenge you when you see these things about these new electric cars, right? No pollutants, right? No. You're just moving them from the end of the tailpipe to some, power plant, over in Sacramento or wherever it might be, right? I mean, so we have to be clear about what we're doing here, about the world is not better off if we burn a bunch of oil over at the power plant, transmit it through energy lines that are losing power all the way, right, that are attenuating the power, so we have to produce 100 units of power here to get 50 units down at your house where you plug your car in. And then you drive your car around. Yeah, okay, so that takes care of the urban smog problem, but it doesn't take care of the climate change problem. So, I mean, I think you want to think about, we need to internalize the externalities to say, what are the environmental costs of all the things we do? And how do we make sure that we get charged for them? And more importantly, how do we get a shift, again, it's an ideological shift, to where I'm willing to pay that? In other words, I think about trying to start a sort of big movement for, saying, let's have an energy tax in this country. But how do you get real normal people to not respond by, I don't want to pay the tax? How do I get you guys to say, I'm willing to pay 20% more on my energy bill? Or 40%, or 100%, or 200%. I'm happy to pay $10 a gallon at the tank. But that's the transition that has to happen. You have to say, I'm happy to pay it because what that'll do is make me reduce how much I drive, and it'll make most people reduce how much they drive, and therefore will have less impact on the environment. And maybe it'll do is send a signal to the, to the car-making corporations to get cars that do 300 miles to the gallon. So we can still have cars. And maybe what it'll do is get some people to ride bikes. And sort of this sort of domino effect of, how do you get that kind of change? But it's not just an economic change. It's not just getting prices instilled, but you can't get prices to reflect real environmental harm unless you've also got people willing to accept those in a democracy. I mean, in some ways, you might want like a dictatorship, with a nice benign dictator who says, we're going to make the world environmentally friendly, and you're all going to pay $50 a gallon, and do all the things, and every environmental externality will be internalized in the prices of the goods you buy. But we've chosen not to have a dictatorship. We have a democracy in which we have to decide that collectively, right? And once again, it's a standard tragedy of commons, right? I don't want to pay that extra cost, and nobody else does. And all of a sudden, we don't end up paying it, and we continue to have externalities. A social transition. And this is an important one, and we haven't talked enough about this. But a transition in how we distribute goods, in equity, basically. I mean, half of the environmental problems are problems that are closely linked to inequitable distribution of resources. Well, there's plenty of food. Many of you I know are in the World Food Economy class. There's plenty of food on the face of the earth every year. Plenty of it goes to waste. The problem is not whether there's enough food being produced. The problem is distribution. And the distribution is not because we can't do it. No, we can get the food to where it needs to go. We don't want to. Right? I mean, so there's a lot of equity issues and a social transition in which precisely what you guys saw on Saturday doesn't happen. Which is precisely that it's not an exchange. It's not that we give you aid and you give us CO2 emissions. We just give you aid because you deserve aid, right? That because things are inequitable, and we need to remedy that. That's the kind of social transition that we're talking about. And maybe you need to do it through some kind of, facade that says, okay, we're paying you for CO2 emissions, but hopefully we pay a premium. That means lets them make a lot of money on CO2 emission reductions, because we're also trying to, bring in an equity, a redistribution of equity. I mean, at least that's something to engage. Sarah, you had a point on this.
I was just going to say that when you were talking about the economic transitions, there could be problems with equity, like just within that.
Right. And I think that's another thing that we haven't engaged here. But when you try to solve one problem, you have to solve multiple problems. So if we're going to say, let's charge 30 cents a kilowatt hour, we sure better if we care about equity, we sure better think about, but there's a lot of poor people who that's half their monthly income if you charge 30. So how do you then say 30 cents a kilowatt hour after the first 1,000 kilowatt hours or whatever the proper unit is? How do you, or how do we have that you get a rebate on your taxes or whatever it is? So you have to say, how do we, and this is things where, you should think about in some of your other classes where you're doing, linear optimization problems and operations research, kind of saying, we got a bunch of things we want to solve at once. How do we do it? We want to optimize across a variety of characteristics. And those are problems that, in fact, there's lots of theories and models out there. Corporations do it all the time, right? Corporations are constantly trying to not just improve their bottom line, but improve employee satisfaction, consumer satisfaction, and all that stuff. That's not always just merely measured by the bottom line, right? And it's certainly not measured by the immediate bottom line, but by a long-term bottom line. And so kind of thinking about how do you trade off different goals and make them all work. And it's usually not that you can get it all together, right? That you probably won't do as good a job at protecting the environment if you're taking care of equity. That's probably just the facts. You may get lucky once in a while. 1 out of 10 things, you may be able to get equity and environmental protection all at the same time at low cost, right? But in most cases, you're going to have to pay a big price, and you won't get as much environmental protection as if you protect equity as if you didn't, right? So those are going to be trade-offs you're going to need to make. Institutional transitions, and this is what a lot of the course has been about, is how do we design and design social institutions that can help us overcome tragedy of the commons, etc. Things like all the problems that lead to the environmental problems we face, all the sources of the environmental problems we face. How do we create institutions to overcome those? How do we create regimes that help solve the problems we're facing, that kind of get people to not be as atomistic in their behavior, as egotistic or egoistic in their behavior, as self-centered in their behavior? How do you get people to care about other things? Or how do you create and structure incentives such that people can continue to be self-interested and they just do the right thing, right? That is, 30 cents a kilowatt hour makes self-interested people still behave the right way. And how do you create social institutions, or how do you create social institutions like international regimes so they work? And I think part of, or not part, 80% of what I push you to do in this course is to take an institution and figure out if it worked, and what worked about it, and how would you make it work in some other arena, and engage those questions. And so those are really hard. The informational transition of knowing more, knowing more about what the problems are. And again, this relates to what I've been trying to push you in the class, knowing more about how to solve it. Not merely what problems are out there, but what solutions are out there, why they work, when they work, how they work, where they might work, all of those questions, engaging all of those. And the last one, and I mean this goes back to the kind of eco-philosophical, is the ideological transition, a value transition. A sense of concern, of raising a sense of concern. And I have tended in this class to sort of, poo-poo the kind of advocates, the kind of enviros, the hardcore left radical, bomb throwing, sort of dam blowing upping, those people. But they're the people who, at least at some level, are pushing people to have different values pretty hard. They're the hardcore saying, no, where you're at right now is not okay, right? The ecofeminists, the bioregionalists, the Gaia principle people, all those people are saying, the deep ecologists, all those people are saying, the way you're thinking is just wrong. And you've got to shift to a different relationship to the environment. And I think in some way, again, going back to what I said initially, the first few weeks of class, is if you can make that one happen, the rest is cake, right? You get people to have the right values, you don't need to worry about the rest of this stuff. If they have the right values, they won't have more kids. They'll be spending most of their days trying to design things that work to protect the environment. They will be internalizing costs even when they don't have to. They will be, giving half of their salary to people who are less well off than themselves. They will be having institutions in the family, in their communities, in their towns, in their cities, in their states, and all of that. They'll be doing that. They will be structuring all of society in a way, in a way that protects the environment. If you can make that change, but that's the hard change, right? That's the hardest change to make. And I think that, so just going back for a second is to think about the sort of different options. And we talked a lot about regimes, about international regimes and treaties and stuff like that. But now these days you see a lot more about a global environmental organization, right? Sort of WEO instead of the WTO, the World Environmental Organization. Is that a way to go? Is that a good option? How would we know? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? Trying to think about that. Orrin Young talks about strengthening the UN. Give the UN more power over this stuff. But how realistic is that? How realistic? What kind of power can it have? How realistic is it that once you gave it that power, that countries would continue to give it that power, continue to allow it to regulate the environment? Other strategies, integrating environment in other areas. Maybe which of the two would you choose? A global environmental organization that goes head-to-head with the WTO? Or just make sure that the WTO, when it's making regulations, worries about the environment? Integrate environmental concerns into the WTO's decision-making, which seems to be at least part of the trend that's happening. One could argue about whether it's going well enough, but environmental concerns are being taken up by the WTO. The decisions may not be in the right direction for many of you, etc., but at least they are being engaged a little bit. And the question is do you want to have some, the question is, do you want to have a perhaps marginalized organization like a World Environmental Organization, which is marginalized, but has one concern and it pushes that concern all the time? Or do you want a integrated environmental concern in the World Trade Organization where even a 5% change in that behavior, the behavior that the World Trade Organization regulates is such a big fraction of our impact on the environment. You can make a 5% change. That might be well worth it there, right? So one has to at least think about those trade-offs. The role of global civil society. Hopefully some of you will not be working for big corporations, but will be working for NGOs. Going out and trying to make change in whatever, whether blowing up dams or building institutions and designing debt for nature swaps or, nice article in this month's National Geographic about, I think it's the Nature Conservancy or Conservation International, but I think it's the Nature Conservancy buying Palmyra Island in the middle of the South Pacific to protect it, for eternity as a place that hasn't been screwed up yet. Nobody ever lived there. So the original trees are still there, but through a process of, negotiating with the owners to protect it, So the role of NGOs, not only in that specific project level, going out and making a difference for small groups, another, just reading this book on called Savages by Joe Kane, about NGOs going into the deep forest, the deep Amazon of eastern Ecuador, and making a difference in whether this culture survives and whether the environment survives against an onslaught of oil exploration, and to say, okay, those are people making a difference too, and making more of a difference than certainly we made in the last 10 weeks sitting in this classroom, right? So, think about what, and then think more broadly about movements, about social movements, and large changes in terms of how society interacts with government at the national and international level. So those are some of the different things. And so I wanted to kind of end up with, I'll give you my own views at the end. I've given my views a lot through the class, but I'll give you sort of my own views. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what I see as somewhat three differences that I've kind of not brought up in the class before. But what does it mean to be a personal environmentalist? What does it mean to be an environmentalist at a personal level? What does it mean to be a political environmentalist? And what does it mean to be a policy environmentalist? And how do you kind of integrate those parts, of yourself, or if you, I assume most people in the room are environmentalists and care about protecting the environment. And so what does it mean to be a personal environmentalist? At a personal level, what does it mean to be an environmentalist? And then kind of move up to what does it mean to be political and what does it mean to be policy environmentalist? Because obviously I've been kind of pushing the last of these, right, to be a policy environmentalist. But I want to go back to what kind of the deeper roots of it. So what does it mean to you guys to be a personal environmentalist? How would you know one if you saw one? Or what do you strive to be as a personal environmentalist? Sarah?
Well, like little things like recycling and like maybe being vegetarian because you're worried about land being taken up by cattle. Like there's a lot of environmental reasons to be vegetarian or vegan.
Okay. Okay, so
like
changes.
Really personal level on like just your daily actions.
Okay, your daily choices, Risa?
I also think of it as like seeing you have a personal impact, because I think a lot of people say, okay, what's the point of me recycling this one can because it's just like one person, it's not gonna hurt anything if I just throw this one can away, and then I think being a personal environmentalist is being aware that all these personal actions add up if everyone's being a personal environmentalist, in a sense.
So believing in it even in the face of you being in a tragedy of the commons. That is saying it's worth doing even if you're the only silly person doing it. In a sense, yeah. Okay, good. I think that's important. That is what it means. It means having a value that says it's not about whether it makes a difference. It's because I believe in it. And it was that most religions in the world aren't based on the fact that it's instrumentally good to do what they tell you to do. Most religions are based on the notion that it's good to do those because they're right. Not because they're effective, right? Not because they make you money or because, just because they're the right thing. You don't kill people because it's the right thing to do. Not because it wouldn't warrant, there aren't people out there who warrant that kind of action, but rather because it's the right thing to do. So yeah, okay. So being a personal environmentalist, good. Others?
I think maybe continuing to challenge your own values, because even after this class, I think it's still hard for any of us to go out and sort of like the idea of paying more for gas or for something like that. So to keep on challenging those, keep on reminding going through reading stuff, reminding, like having people keep updated, keep sort of informed, and also keep sharing, like people that share it back and forth, and keep on arguing, like both sides maybe, to figure out what's actually happening.
It's kind of along the same lines, like remember always that there's a ripple effect. Like, I've talked to my friends that are, completely, against any kind of environmental movement, and, over the course of years, maybe, my constant little pricking, their not completely thought through ideas has, made a change. I mean, even if it's only like what she said, they're buying cloth towels instead of paper towels, or, things like that. I mean, it all adds up. But what's more important is you're changing, normative behavior, the norms that they base their behavior on. So, and you get enough of that together, and eventually, I mean, we're going to have, wide-scale change.
Okay. So that Reese's thing does two things. One is that her behavior changes make a difference in themselves, and they also lead me to say, Reese is a pretty cool person, and she recycles, so maybe I should recycle. And if everybody in the room recycles, I start feeling guilty if I don't recycle, right? So, yeah. So, okay. So it's not merely doing, and it's some combination of doing it and talking about it, and engaging people, and being willing to be in that uncomfortable position of being the only environmentalist in the room, saying, we should recycle all the cans today, or whatever. Okay, others?
And to avoid being a hypocrite, like I remember a very embarrassing.
Not possible, Diane. Not possible.
Where I was, espousing my environmental view, and someone happened to notice that the bag that I brought all my stuff in was leather, which they're like, I'm sorry, that just doesn't jive. And I came up with them. I makes you school. It was a gift. But seriously, we need to follow through with our own, statements and ideals.
Others? And one thing to think about is kind of re-listen to what was just said, and think about the fact that this course is going to be retaught in Russia and the Ukraine, and when people say, well, personal environmentalists, and they're looking at a bunch of Americans, right, talking about this, and what do you think their response, what do you think is going on in the room 6 months from now? When they watch this discussion and say, okay, so here's these Americans talking about being personal environmentalists. Hanky, you were laughing. So what's your response? What do you think what will happen?
Well, actually, Allie just gave a presentation in one of our other classes, and it was about ecological footprints.
Okay.
And I don't know, she could probably explain better, but I guess I'll summarize a little bit. So the whole idea of it was that like everyone in the world is allocated like a certain number of resources. And like there's this thing online, you can take this little test, and then you get like your footprint and like how many resources you're using. And like, I think when I took it, I used like 80% of what the average American uses. But if you like look at that in terms of like what every person on the planet is supposed to be allocated, was it like 2 times as much?
The average American uses 10.7 hectares, and equitably, we should each have 1.47 hectares.
Okay, so we use 10 times too much, 8 times too much, something like that. 7 or 8 times too much. And a hectare is like, what, 2.5 acres?
It's about 2 football fields.
Two football fields? Okay, good. Okay. And we on average use 10 of those?
Yeah.
And we should get 1.5?
And like, there's this little thing like, we need like 4.6 Earths. Is that right?
Yeah, just like for mine and Hanky's.
Okay.
If everybody in the world was like me and Hanky,
then we would need 5 Earths to cover you guys. Yeah, okay. And you don't fly half as much as I do, so I need like 10 Earths to do what my lifestyle does. And going back to Diana's point, all my trips are for environmental conferences, so it's okay. Okay, so one is so go with that. So what does that make you just sort of say, oh my God, shut up about it, Sarah, already with the vegetarian stuff, right? No, because I think that's partly, on the one hand, I'm completely with you guys on this, but on the other hand, there's a part of me of recycling. Hello? This is not the problem, recycling here, right? It's buying the damn thing in the first place, It's not, recycling is not the issue, right? Being vegetarian is not the issue, it's how much you eat. Because the vast bulk of the people in the world do not eat as much as you do, right? Wow. But I'm not, sorry. No, I'm just picking on you, Sarah. Please do not take this seriously. No, it's how much it's how much all of us eat, it's how much all of us buy, it's how much all of us consume. That leads to this needing 10 Earths to do it, right? And that I guess my sense is when Risa talks about recycling, we're thinking, oh, so you want to get it down from, 10.7 football fields to 10.6. You go, girl. Right? I mean, but there's that sense of, okay, wait, are we just playing around at the margins here or not? And my sense is, if you look at this nice middle-class American world we live in from the outside, and you say, you guys don't get it. From the outside, you say, you guys just don't get it. This is serious change. This is not just minuscule change. This is not change at the margin. This is fundamental change that has to occur if we're going to get down from the 4.6 Earths that we need to cover you guys, or cover everybody if they live the way we live. And again, my guess is that you guys on average are good. You've got it down to 80%. That's fabulous. That's a 20% reduction. That's wonderful, right? So on the other hand, and I'm sure Sarah's at 70%, right? So Sarah's behavior has made a difference. But 70%, a 30% reduction gets us down to 7 football fields instead of 1.5. So it goes back to this goal achievement versus counterfactual behavior, evaluation, right? Yes, it's wonderful that you guys and that all of us try to be environmental and change our behavior accordingly. And it's distressing as hell that we make so little progress, right? That we don't achieve our goals, and yet we make progress towards them. So I think it's just to kind of, bring that alternative perspective about, and to use a sense of, to all of you travel, all of you have spent time overseas or will spend time overseas or whatever, to look around you and realize what's happening and realize how different it is. And realize, one, how much environmental damage gets done by poverty, And on the other hand, realize how much environmental damage gets done by affluence, and that both are problems in very different ways. But I think, the footprint analysis is really important stuff to think about, if only because it raises your consciousness to say, God, I'd like to be down at only 8 football fields. For me, and you guys to be down at 3 football fields, or for me to say, no, I should get down to the 4.6 Earths or whatever you guys are using, right, instead of the 10 that I'm using, or that I'm promoting by my behavior. So I think that's a really important part to just keep track of what it means to be a personal environmentalist in America. Is only like 5, 10, 20% change, and if Henke's down at only 20%, that's huge, relative to most Americans who are at 1.7 or 2.0 or whatever the number is, very multiples. The people who have these $1 million houses and scrape them down, take them to the dump, and build a new one that's $3 million or whatever, right? Other points on personal environmentalism. Allie, did you want to say more? Eli?
Or I guess one of the questions I had when you were talking about this class being taught whatever in Russia is just like, I feel like they have to worry about such different problems than we have to too. It's sort of like looking at like what we think, like recycling. It's just like when you don't have enough like oil or like money to like heat your home in the winter, like I think you're worrying about a lot of different things in recycling,
right. Yeah.
Beer cans or stuff like that too.
And it's hard to worry about, if you're spending most of your day doing something that's putting food on the table for your family or whatever, dealing with those other problems, you may not have a lot of time left over to worry about the environmental impacts of those behaviors. That it may take the bulk of your time to we have a lot of leisure time in America. Leisure time to worry about taking out the recycling, to worry about buying something other than a leather bag, and to spend the extra hour you need to shopping to find a non-leather bag, whatever it is, to not be hypocritical. How do you do that? Emily?
That's where the world leaders come in, and the leaders of Russia or whoever has contact with societies that have done it differently, or maybe can take things from planned communities that take into account having trees instead of air conditioners, or all these innovative things that we've thought of. I don't know, it's leaders that need to bring those to the people. If the people can't be thinking about it, somebody needs to be thinking about it for them. We're skipping our problems, hopefully.
Okay. So that's a nice segue to, so what's a political environmentalist like? You're talking about leaders. Those are political environmentalists, right? You're saying we need leaders who are political environmentalists. What does that mean? How can you be a political environmentalist? So you do the recycling, you buy the plastic bag. Well, not plastic, that's an oil well, but you figure out something that doesn't have, right, organically grown cotton or whatever it is, bag, right? And you're recycling, you're eating you're vegan, now whatever. You've shifted all of your behaviors. You've done that at a personal level. So what does it mean to be a political environmentalist, Emily?
It means somebody who's taking their personal views and trying to. Okay, wait. Policy. That's a different.
The policy one would be a third, yeah.
Okay, so I'd call somebody like, I just talked to my brother last night, or 2 nights ago, and he's planning this. Well, he said for the first time in Atlanta, there's like a vegan punk community that's like, I don't know, there's like a political will in Atlanta to get things changed, so they're having a large critical mass, like bicycle. They're gonna all go down to the city streets of Atlanta and get on their bicycles and have a protest and just talk about bicycling in Atlanta, because there's no bike lanes or anything. Atlanta's terrible, but so I'd call him a political environmentalist, somebody who's taking the next step, where instead of just worrying about themselves, taking it to, the polis.
Okay. Okay.
Trying to induce change at the state or national level, I guess.
Or even local.
Speak up a little so everybody can hear.
Yeah, trying to induce change at this local or state or national level.
Okay, so it's just the extension of what Diana, I guess, was starting out by saying. You have to talk to somebody, right? You can be a personal environmentalist is personal, meaning you just do it yourself, and you maybe sort of at the extreme Reese's sense of you do it because you believe it's good and nobody else has to know. And the next step is to talk to your friends when you're having beers, and that's the beginning of a political environmentalist, right? And it can go, to your friends, to your community, to local, state, national, international level. Diana.
So is that only considered as like a intermediary step between personal level and what international level?
I don't know. I don't know what the answer. It's sort of. I think these are good discussion questions. I don't know what does it mean to you?
Like someone who, I was in touch with people for the ethical treatment of animals, and they're trying to. Stanford has the dissection policy and the animal experimentation policy in effect, and so they're trying to get students who will be willing to kind of take a chance and change the Stanford policy, because they think that that's a terrible thing to do. So would you consider that being policy, or it would be political because it's on a lower level than like national level?
I don't know. What do other people think? I guess my feeling is that it's sort of political because it's about trying to, it's trying to, I guess one of the ways I'd see it is I see political as trying to shift goals, and policy as shifting means. That is, I would see, so what your brother's doing is trying to shift the goals, get people to, it's not about doing the bike lanes, to get people to want to do, non-car transport. It's getting a shift in what people's values are. It's trying to induce this ideological transition at a political level. I guess is the distinction I would make. But I would welcome people saying no. There's other distinctions or there's other parts to it. But I mean.
Oh, okay. So not necessarily the size of the change. I mean, because I was thinking more like policy is global and.
Oh yeah, no, not at all.
Okay, so that in effect would be political because it's trying to restructure the ideological basis of it, and the policy would be, how do we implement that and how to do it most effectively and blah blah blah.
Right.
All right.
Yeah, that's at least the kind of distinction I would have in my head. Yeah. Others about political. I guess partly about the means about what's political. Is it just going out and demonstrating? Or spilling blood on files, for that, or spray painting mink coats, or whatever PETA does, right?
It's your vote too.
Kari, and then.
Well, I think it's down to something as simple as your vote.
Okay. To your vote and how you get involved in the political process. Do you join the Democratic National Committee and start pushing for an environmental platform? Okay. So as high as that. Okay.
It's generally just fundamentally about getting certain issues on the agenda. And as long as you get them onto the political agenda at the local level, at the state level, at any level, that means that at least someone's going to be forced to talk about them. Mm-hmm. And as long as you force people to talk about them, then at least they're thinking about it, and you have the chance that, some sort of policy is going to come up. Whether it's going to be a good one, that's when you have to switch over into policy mode and say, well, no, actually, that's a bad way of going about it. But as long as you can get things onto the national agenda, just by being a non-governmental organization, lobbying or protesting or writing letters or any of those things, then you are drastically increasing the chances of effective things coming out of that.
Mm-hmm. And I think, an important part of framing is that, a important part of putting something on an agenda is that it frames things, that it sets it up so that, before the era of recycling, companies just throwing out their trash were just throwing out their trash. Now they're not recycling, right? They are, that is specifically not recycling. Or to think that this, just as a recent example, to think of that the decision by Bush not to to regulate CO2, right, yesterday, is a decision not to regulate CO2, right, as opposed to just going about business as usual, with it never getting raised. It would never had people not pushed that we need to regulate CO2 onto the agenda, Bush wouldn't have had to not do it yesterday, right? So it's this sense of getting it on the agenda. So what's the plus side then? This would seem, at least on its face, to say, well, yeah, Megan's wrong. You get it on the agenda, and it gets kicked out, right? You just turn it down. So where's the plus side of having gotten CO2 regulation on the agenda? Why isn't this a tale that says, oh, come on, Megan, stop being so naive. Getting it on the agenda doesn't count. You have to go in and bust some people's heads until we get some policy change around here.
Well, you find it brings out all the reasons why people are against that, so that you can sort of organize your argument again, come back with greater information to present, revamp and present the policy again, have a more effective idea.
Okay, so you try it once and you fail and you come back again, having learned hopefully from the experience. Okay. Other reasons why getting on the agenda might matter just in itself?
Well, once it's on the agenda, and if you look at George Bush, and you can say, okay, he failed to protect the environment. So he has something that he was supposed to do, he didn't do, and then you have the ability to say, you have not followed through on something that you were supposed to do, and here are the ways in which you need to make it up. Okay. So you have something sort of hold people up against and say, this is what you're supposed to be doing, this is what you're doing, and you need to make up this gap.
Okay. Kate?
I was going to say that now it made some headlines at least. People,
okay. So you're raising visibility a couple times.
Most people probably wouldn't have even thought about it, but now there are headlines that say Bush, reneges on his promise to whatever.
Okay. So there's a combination. What's nice is there's a combination between what Kate and Megan saying. One is, what Kate's saying is you get it in people's heads, and Megan's saying, and you get it in their heads with a certain normative spin on it, right? That is not merely talking about CO2, but thinking that that there's a right side to this question, right? Or at least two sides to this question, that it used to be just an economic decision. Why regulate business, right? Now it's because we want to protect the environment, and now we're having to make a trade-off between these two, right? And so, so things shift, so that you're both making people that they have to deal with something and address something, and they have to address it in a normative context which says some things are better than other things, right? To say, no, it's not all right to kill whales anymore, or it is, right? But you have a discussion about that, a normative discussion, a dialogue. Megan.
Ideally, it also raises the political costs of making those decisions.
Okay.
George Bush can't just say, no, actually, I don't really care about regulating this, so I'm not going to deal with it. He actually has to stop and think, what effect is that going to have on, the public image, on foreign policy, on his polls? There is a political cost to not regulating the environment, regulating CO2 or protecting the environment. And that hopefully that sort of raises the incentive for political leaders to keep making efforts.
Okay. So we can talk about that nationally. Internationally, do you think political costs matter much? Go back to the climate change simulation on Saturday and, think about how real life it was. Would the political cost of not having protected the environment had made much difference? How much were people worried about that other countries would say they were not protecting the environment?
I think for Europe it matters, but it's harder maybe
Within Europe or outside?
within Europe.
Okay, within the countries.
Yeah, I think I don't maybe I mean I think there's a lot of interdependence between. If Germany had gone off and started completely increasing their emissions, that Norway would have had a fit or something and would have it would have been.
But do you think the Germans care what the Norwegians think? If the Germans think that it's in our economic interest to do X, and the Norwegians say, yeah, but you're hurting the environment. The Germans have already thought about that and decided, yes, well, we still like our economic growth over our environmental protection. And the Norwegians say, what do the Germans say to the Norwegians?
Well, I mean, it's
you can think of whatever German phrases there are, but they're not generally, oh, we're sorry, right?
Well, isn't the U.S. getting a lot of condemnation from Europe, and so it's sort of...
Okay, but here's the thing I want to keep pushing on. Yes, we are. And what is it doing to our policy? Right? Yes, what you're telling me is there's an independent variable going in, and I'm saying, yeah, but what's happening to the dependent variable? We just had a decision yesterday to not do it. Sorry, Diana.
I mean, we don't know. We don't know what that effect is having. I mean, let's say there wasn't any political pressure whatsoever, and so the counterfactual would have been placed much higher. Let's just say, American behavior. Europe's condemnation goes around, and so we say, oh, whatever. But I mean, without that condemnation, people do take that into account. Well, we know if we do such and such that these parties are going to blow their whistle, and this is going to be problem for this and this and this, and so maybe they do regulate their behavior. I mean, you can't say that with no condemnation at all.
On the agenda in the first place.
Well, they their behavior might have been much more. You're frowning like you don't understand what I'm saying. Like, let's
Keep
just
going. I'm waiting.
Never have regulated CO2.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I mean, their behavior may have been,
that's the right question.
More damaging.
That I'm going to call success right here. Is that to have you thinking that way? That's the right question. And then we could spend all day and do a lot of research on what the counterfactual was, but that's the right question. Was our behavior any different because of that pressure? And to get at that answer, we need to know what would have happened in the absence of that pressure. Would it have been even worse than it is? And if so, then the pressure made a huge difference because it made it a little bit better. Not as good as, again, I'm comparing the not regulating CO2 to what I want, which is regulating CO2. You're comparing it to what wouldn't have even been talking about it absent the pressure. Great, that's exactly right. Perfect analysis. Risa. You had at a different point.
Yeah, I've lost it somewhere along the way, so
okay.
I'll come back.
Okay. Okay, last, policy environmentalist. What's a policy environmentalist look like? How do you be how do you become, or how do you act like a policy environmentalist? Well, no, I want to push it. I guess how do you? What's the kind of lessons learned from this class? Because that's what I would say as a policy environmentalist. Mm-hmm. Okay, what does that mean?
Counterfactuals.
Okay.
Just be able to look at a problem and not come away with different reasons for the answer, I suppose.
Okay.
Well,
Others? Sorry?
Also going beyond, looking at a problem and saying, oh, that's wrong. Really saying, well, okay, what do we do, and what are the effects that it's going to have of this solution, and not just fix this by the easy way out.
Okay. Others? Go.
I'm looking at what else has worked, comparing different things, assessing the positive effectiveness.
Okay.
Of other regimes.
Yeah, and let's say you get a job with George Bush on a panel of some sort or whatever that he's going to be drawing policy from, and so your recommendations take into account, well, this and this has been tried and this has been shown to be effective, and this is why, and you're trying to address this particular problem in such a particular way, and you want a particular result, you have to do such and such, whatever it is.
Good.
And of course in his case he'd probably disregard everything anyway, but at least you'd have your facts straight and be presenting a coherent plan or whatever.
Okay, good. Others? I mean, all of you who did World Food Economy were being policy environmentalists, right? I mean, in terms of the things you were looking at in World Food Economy, right? I mean, what to do, both projecting what's going to happen. But I think a lot of it is about, I think Sarah hit on an important point, which is to say, there's lots of policy proposals out there, but we got a lot of experience. You know, there's 400 multilateral treaties out there waiting to be examined. You examined 15 of them in this class. That's great. That's huge progress. You know, but there's very few things that are completely new under the sun. There are some, you know, but there's very few that are completely new, and that we can learn from experience, you know, and being careful to how we generalize, but to say what are our goals? What are the options out there? Which ones work better relatively to others? Which ones are we sure made an effect? What are the downside effects? What are the perverse outcomes that we should watch out for, etc.? So I think that's what I've hoped to give you some tools for. And it's not at all to say you shouldn't be political environmentalists and you should only be policy environmentalists or it shouldn't be personal. It's to say, no, this is just one more tool in your toolkit and you can use it or not. There's a lot of other ways to approach the world than the kind of this rigorous empirical analysis stuff I've done. And I encourage you to use those other tools. But this is one tool that I think is useful for achieving certain kinds of change in the world. Not all kinds of change by any stretch. But to say, you know, you have to get out there, and for certain kinds of things, you have to know what will make a difference, you know? And you want to be sure that you're right, because again, the resources are very limited that we're going to have to solve these problems, and we want to deploy them effectively and efficiently. I'll just kind of end with a few points on my views on what I think are sort of what I see as being a full environmentalist or doing this stuff well. It seems to be the first thing you need. And it's really important. It goes to this ideological transition. You need heartfelt concern. You need to care about what happens. And you need to care about it more than other things. You need to care about it more than making your next $1 million. You need to care about it relative to the other things that you want to value in the world, you know, that you can value. And that's where everything starts. And I just assumed everybody came in with that. Or that I can't change it. That there's not much. And you can. You can change it by, as Diana was talking about, sitting down and just talking to people. That's how you change it. You change it through those little incremental processes by which you change people's minds about what they care about. And I don't think these are not just about environmentalism. These are about social change in general. Whether it's about heartfelt concern about female genital mutilation, about human rights abuses of other sorts, about economic growth, about equity, about all these things. You have to care about that first, and that's where it's got to start. The second is creative innovation. So I tend to badmouth a lot of innovation because it's not tested. But we do need people to come up with new ideas. The notion of debt for nature stops was a hugely creative innovation, and it worked really well. And it was something that there probably wasn't a lot of experience to draw on. You know, there wasn't a lot of ways to say, would this work? Well, we have other things that look like it, and they worked. No, there weren't other things that looked like it. So it wasn't. You couldn't go out there and test whether it would work beforehand. You had to go out and try. You had to do it and then test. Okay? But initially, you just needed some creative innovation. You need people to come up with new ideas about how to make things work that have some logic to them, that make sense, that seem like they might work, and that's great. So you need people who are out there creating new ways of doing things, thinking up new ways to attack old problems, taking risks, you know, doing all that. And I think a lot of that has to do with being open to a notion that your own preconceptions and your own views might be wrong. You know, and being open to other people. I mean, this was what Kari was raising earlier, you know, being kind of reading new stuff and being open to new views, you know, kind of always challenging yourself, always being self-critical. So I see heartfelt concern, creative innovation. Third is careful implementation, being sensitive to local conditions, right? When you start doing something, don't think you know it all. When you guys go in and work for the Peace Corps, don't go in with your plan and then implement it. Go down, say, here's what don't say anything for starters. Listen. Find out what those people need. And maybe they don't need, maybe their priorities are not that they really need a new water system. Maybe they need a sewage system instead. Maybe they need something else. So listen. And then engage other people in that process. 10 heads are better than one most of the time. And just because you went to Stanford and got a master's in Earth Systems doesn't mean you're the brightest person on the block. There's a lot of ways you can learn from a lot of people who have a lot of other information. So create, kind of being careful in how you implement things and how you apply things. That all the stuff, you've been learning about, this works. It doesn't always work. You want to think, will it work in this context? Can I generalize from this, Pacific Salmon Treaty to some other fishery in the South Pacific? Maybe the people are different. Maybe their cultures are different. Maybe the technologies are different, and maybe it won't work there, right? You're not dealing with rivers, you're dealing with ocean fish, and maybe that matters, you know? So being careful about implementation. Thoughtful evaluation. Constantly, consistently, and rigorously check that we actually achieve what we intended to achieve. Did you get there? Doing the stuff I'm talking about on other people's projects, on your own project after it's done. You know, do the evaluation that you guys did today. Did it work? Did this class work? You know, was it successful? And then lastly, non-defensive revision. You know, to go back and say, huh, no, it didn't work. And I'm not going to hold on to it because it's mine and my ego is invested in doing it. I'm going to try to say, how do I do it better next time? You know, and I think those are for me, you know, that you kind of admit you make mistakes, recognize you make bad investments, you know, in policies, and say, okay, that was a mistake. We did it wrong. We got to do something new. You know, and that involves being, you know, large enough and big enough to be non-defensive, to say, yeah, I made a mistake. So shoot me. You know, at least there's two kinds of people. People who make mistakes and continue them, and people who make mistakes and change them. You know, and so those are for me sort of my own views. Emily?
I wanted to say, I had this funny conversation with this person who was very, very much not an environmentalist, and he said to me, he's like, he just thought it was easy for environmentalists to protect the environment because the environment never speaks back, and so can't get angry if you do something wrong.
Well, although actually one might argue that it does speak back, right? Yeah. And we've gotten it wrong several times, and it actually is speaking back in terms of, but yes, it's much. It doesn't give you the immediate feedback, and it certainly doesn't tell you the causal stuff. And so you do have to be careful and thoughtful about evaluating what did you do and did it work and did it get what you wanted to get. So I'll leave it there. If you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Thanks very much.